The letter from her editor arrived on a Tuesday in March of 1878, and it contained within its neat, ink-dark lines a proposition that Jane Morgan would later describe as the most consequential mistake she ever made, and simultaneously, the greatest gift the universe had ever seen fit to deliver to her doorstep. She had been sitting at her writing desk in her Boston apartment, the windows fogged with the particular wet cold that clung to the city in early spring, when she sliced the envelope open with her silver letter knife and read the words that would dismantle every careful plan she had assembled for her life. The Boston Illustrated Gazette wanted her, their most ambitious correspondent, to travel west to the New Mexico territory and spend a single season documenting the lives of the people carving civilization out of raw land. One season. 4 months. She would be back in Boston by the end of summer, her editor promised, with enough material for a series of articles that would establish her name as one of the finest journalists writing in America. Jane Morgan was 26 years old, sharp-minded and sharp-tongued, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned in serious coils at the nape of her neck, and eyes the color of the Atlantic on an overcast afternoon, a kind of gray-green that seemed to shift depending on her mood. She had spent the last 3 years building her reputation at the Gazette, covering everything from factory labor disputes to the suffragette meetings held in parlors across Beacon Hill. She was not a woman given to sentiment or impulsiveness. She made lists. She kept schedules. She believed deeply in the power of a well-organized plan. She told her editor yes, packed 2 trunks and 1 small valise, and boarded a train heading southwest 3 weeks later, telling herself with absolute conviction that she would be home again before the summer heat could fade to autumn. She was wrong about that. She was spectacularly, wonderfully, completely wrong. The journey itself was a revelation. Jane had traveled before, to Washington and New York, and once to Philadelphia for a suffragette conference. But she had never seen the land open up the way it did once the train crossed the Missouri River and began its long push through the territories. The plain spread out in every direction like something God had forgotten to finish, vast and gold, and humbling in a way that the crowded streets of Boston could never quite replicate. She pressed her face to the train window and felt something loosen in her chest, some long-held tightening she had not even known was there. She arrived in the town of Cale's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, on the 15th of April, 1878. It was a proper frontier town, meaning that it had 2 saloons, a general store, a small church built from pale adobe, a blacksmith who doubled as the town dentist, and a sheriff whose name was Earl Hutchins, and who wore his badge with the weary authority of a man who had seen entirely too much and expected to see more. The population was perhaps 300 souls, not counting the ranchers and their hands who came in from the surrounding land on weekends and made the saloons briefly prosperous before disappearing again into the dust. Jane's accommodations had been arranged by the Gazette through a correspondence with the town's only boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Rosalie Vega, a small and formidably competent Mexican-American woman of perhaps 50 who kept her gray-streaked hair in a long braid down her back and her opinions about everything in a constant, ready state of deployment. The room was clean, the bed was narrow, and the window looked out over the main street, which Jane found ideal. She wanted to watch. She wanted to understand this place before she wrote about it. She spent her first 2 weeks doing exactly that. She walked the streets with her notebook and her careful, observant eyes. She talked to the shopkeeper, a man named Gerald Bright who had a gift for gossip and a genuine love of history. She talked to the women who gathered at the well each morning, women from different backgrounds and different countries and different circumstances, all of them shaped by this same fierce land. She attended the Sunday service at the Adobe Church and sat in the back pew and listened to the Reverend's sermon, and watched the congregation the way she always watched everything, with the patient attention of someone assembling a picture from individual, scattered pieces. What she noticed most in those early weeks was the quality of the silence. There was more of it out here than she had ever experienced before, and it was different from the silence of her apartment or the silence of a library. It was alive somehow. It pressed against you and asked questions that you had not necessarily planned to answer. She had been in Cal's crossing for exactly 17 days when she first saw Henry Crawford. She was walking along the edge of town near the livery stable, her notebook open, jotting down observations about the way the afternoon light hit the mountains to the west, when she heard the sound of hooves and turned to see a rider coming in from the north road. There was nothing immediately unusual about this. Riders came in from the north road all the time. But something made her stop and look properly, and when she did, she felt the curious sensation of watching something that was precisely where it was supposed to be. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered in the way of men who work with their bodies every day, with dark hair curling slightly beneath the brim of a worn brown hat, and a face that was weathered and angular and honest. He rode with the particular ease of someone for whom horseback was as natural as walking, his hands loose on the reins, his posture neither rigid nor careless but simply present. He wore a faded blue shirt and working trousers and boots that had clearly covered significant ground, and he led 2 additional horses behind him, both loaded with supplies. He did not notice her. He rode straight to the livery stable and dismounted with the efficient grace of long practice and began speaking to the stable hand, gesturing toward one of the pack horses with what appeared to be a question about its left foreleg. His voice, when it reached her, was low and unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who chose words carefully and spent them accordingly. Jane realized she had stopped walking. She made herself continue. She asked Gerald Bright about him the following morning, describing what she had seen. Tall fellow, dark hair, came in with pack horses. Gerald repeated, leaning on his counter with the air of a man who enjoyed this kind of conversation. That be Henry Crawford. Works the Calloway ranch out to the northeast, about 8 miles. Good man. Quiet. Doesn't come to town much more than necessary. His family homesteaded here years back, before the Calloway operation bought up most of the surrounding land. Henry stayed on as foreman when his folks moved to Santa Fe. How long has he been here? Jane asked, making a note, telling herself it was professional curiosity. Born here near enough, Gerald said, or close enough to count. He's about 32 now, I reckon. Knows this land better than any man I've met, and I've met plenty. Jane thanked him, closed her notebook, and thought nothing more of it, or tried not to. She saw Henry Crawford again 4 days later at the general store. He was buying flour and salt, and what appeared to be several lengths of rope, and he was doing it with the concentrated focus of a man who had a list in his head and was working through it methodically. She was at the far end of the counter, selecting ink for her pen, and she became aware of him the way you sometimes become aware of a fire in a room, not because it is doing anything dramatic, but because it is warm. He glanced at her. Their eyes met briefly, the way strangers' eyes meet in a small store where there is no avoiding acknowledgement, and he gave her the polite, restrained nod of someone who has noted your existence and means you no discomfort by it, and then looked back at his purchases. Jane looked back at her ink. 2 minutes later, as she was counting out coins to pay, she heard his voice addressed to Gerald. "Who's the woman with the notebook?" he asked quietly, but not so quietly that she couldn't hear. "Reporter from Boston," Gerald said. "Name's Jane Morgan, writing a piece about the territory." A pause. "Boston. That's right. Long way to come," Henry Crawford said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only the plain statement of a fact about distance. She turned around then, because she was not someone who let observations about her go without at least acknowledging them. "It is a long way," she agreed. "But I find the territory rather more interesting than the distance would suggest." He turned toward her. Close, she could see that his eyes were a light, warm brown, almost amber, the color of creek water running over sand in late afternoon. They held a quality she found difficult to name immediately, a kind of settled attention, as if he were genuinely considering what she had just said rather than simply waiting for the social interaction to complete itself. "Miss Morgan," he said, and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was habitual and courteous rather than performative. "Henry Crawford." "Yes," she said, "I know, Gerald told me." Something moved in his expression that might have been amusement. He would. Gerald, for his part, had developed a sudden intense interest in a row of canned goods behind him. "Are you headed back to your ranch?" Jane asked, because she was a journalist and asking questions was simply what she did, and she was not going to pretend it was anything more complicated than that. "After I finish here, would you mind if I asked you a few questions? For my article, Gerald tells me you know the land out here better than most." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of reluctance exactly, but the quiet of someone who was genuinely deciding. "I can give you a few minutes," he said finally. "I've got a long ride back." They sat on the boardwalk outside the general store for 20 minutes, while he answered her questions with the same careful economy he seemed to apply to everything. And Jane wrote notes in her small, precise handwriting, and tried to pay attention only to the information he was giving her rather than the way he gave it, the unhurried certainty of it, as if he had thought about these things for a long time and had no anxiety about sharing what he had concluded. He told her about the land, the way the seasons moved through it, the pattern of the rains, the character of the mountains to the west that the local Pueblo people called by names he tried to pronounce correctly and clearly respected enough to learn. He told her about the ranching operation, the cycles of cattle drives, and the brutal arithmetic of survival in a place where water was everything and rain was unreliable. He spoke with quiet anger about the ways the land was being stripped and fenced and parceled out, about the Homestead Act and its promises and its gaps, about the people who had been here far longer than any homesteader and who were being pushed steadily into smaller and smaller corners of the world that had belonged to them entire. Jane's pen moved quickly. "You feel strongly about that," she said. "Don't you?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, not a challenge. "Yes," she said. "Actually, I do." He nodded as if this answered something. Then he stood, touched his hat again, said he wished her good luck with her writing, and walked to the livery to collect his horse. He rode out of town toward the northeast, and Jane watched him go and then looked down at her notes, and realized she had written twice as much about what he had said as she had about anything else in 17 days. She told herself this was because he was a good source of information. The weeks that followed were full and busy and productive, in the way that weeks are when you are genuinely engaged with a place and its people. Jane walked miles every day, notebook in hand. She talked to everyone who would talk to her, the blacksmith, the school teacher, the women who washed laundry at the edge of town, the ranchers' wives who came in on Saturdays, the men who gathered at the saloon and who were variously suspicious, and then charmed by a woman who asked them questions and actually listened to the answers. She sent her first dispatch to Boston in May. Her editor wrote back immediately to say it was the finest piece of frontier journalism the Gazette had published in a decade. He was very enthusiastic. He mentioned, gently, that the planned 4-month stay might perhaps be extended to 5 if the material continued at this quality. Jane replied that she would consider it. She saw Henry Crawford twice more in May. Once at the Saturday market, where he bought provisions and exchanged words with a few of the other ranchers' men in the spare, efficient way of people who understand each other well enough to need very few of them. He acknowledged her with that same restrained nod, and she nodded back, and she noticed that he stood slightly apart from the clusters of men around him, not unfriendly but somehow self-contained in a way she recognized, because she felt it herself sometimes. That particular quality of being in a group without quite belonging to it. The second time was at the sheriff's office, where she had gone to ask Earl Hutchins about the recent troubles between a local cattle operation and a family of homesteaders who had staked a claim on land that the cattlemen considered their grazing rights. Henry Crawford was already there when she arrived, leaning against the doorframe with his hat in his hands, clearly having just come from a conversation with the sheriff. He made way for her with a quiet courtesy that she found she was beginning to associate with him specifically. "Are you here about the Delacroix claim?" she asked him, because again, she was a journalist and the question was obvious. He looked at her steadily. "Are you?" "Yes," he nodded slowly. "The homesteaders have a legal right to that land," he said. "The Callaway operation knows it. What they're doing is pressure, not law. Will the sheriff back the homesteaders?" "Earl's a fair man," Henry said, "but he's also one man with one deputy." She looked at him. "And where do you stand in all this? You work for Callaway." Something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness, but a kind of careful honesty. "I work for Callaway," he confirmed. "And I told Mr. Callaway this morning that if he tries to run those homesteaders off legal land, I'll have no part in it." Jane wrote that down. Henry Crawford watched her write it without protest. "May I quote you?" she asked. "You can quote me as a ranch hand who knows the law," he said. "Leave my name out. It would only complicate things." She respected that. She left his name out. What she could not leave out, she was slowly discovering, was the growing awareness she carried with her now when she walked around Cal's crossing, the awareness that she was listening, in some peripheral and entirely inadvertent way, for a low, unhurried voice that chose its words carefully and spent them well. June arrived and brought with it a heat that settled over the territory like a physical weight, pressing down on the town and the surrounding land in a way that seemed to make everything slightly more vivid, more saturated, more urgent. The sky was the kind of blue that had no business existing in nature, and the sunsets over the western mountains were so extravagant that Jane had given up trying to describe them adequately and had simply started writing down the way they made her feel instead. She had extended her stay, as her editor had suggested. 5 months, possibly 6. Her apartment in Boston was being looked after by a neighbor. Her life there was waiting for her, patient and orderly and complete, and she thought about it less than she expected to. It was on the 3rd Saturday of June that the thing happened that she would later mark as the beginning of everything, though the beginning had been creeping up on her for weeks. She had ridden out with a small group of townspeople to see the site of a new water well being dug by the homesteading community at the east edge of the territory, a cooperative project that several families had pooled resources to accomplish. Jane had borrowed a horse from the livery, a gentle mare named Pearl who seemed to find the whole enterprise mildly amusing, and had ridden out with Gerald's wife, Maria, and the schoolteacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Prout. Henry Crawford was at the well site. She had not known he would be, and when she saw his horse tied near the group of men doing the digging, she felt something shift in her chest that she chose, deliberately, not to examine. He was working alongside the homesteaders, she realized. On his Saturday off from the Callaway operation, he had ridden 8 miles to help dig a well for families who needed one. He was shirtless in the heat, which Jane registered with the neutral clinical eye of a trained observer, and not, she was very firm about this, any other kind of eye. He noticed her when she dismounted. Something in his expression opened slightly, the way a door does when someone on the other side recognizes the knock. He came toward her, pulling his shirt back on, and his hat had left a line on his forehead, and his hair was dark with sweat, and he looked, she thought, entirely in his element. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I didn't expect to see you out here." "I didn't know you'd be here," she said, and then felt obscurely that this had revealed too much about her own awareness of his whereabouts and added quickly, "Are you helping with the well?" "It's the right thing to do," he said simply. "They need water. I know something about digging." She glanced at the work being done, 5 men deep in a hole they were reinforcing with timber, others hauling dirt, the homesteading women providing food and water and encouraging words. "How much do you know about well digging?" she asked. "More than most," he said. "My father and I dug the first well on our homestead when I was 14. That water's still running." She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have run out of the things they use to keep a certain kind of distance and are not sure yet what to do about that. "I'd like to write about this," she said, "about what you're all doing here, the cooperative effort, the community of it. Write about them, he said, gesturing toward the homesteading families. They're the ones who matter in this story. You're part of the story too, she said. He shook his head, not dismissively but with genuine conviction. I'm just a man with a shovel. She wrote it all down anyway, the cooperative project, the names of the families involved, the history of the land claim, the way the people worked together with a kind of practical solidarity that had no need to announce itself. She also, in the private notebook she kept separate from her working notes, wrote something about a man with amber eyes who helped dig wells on his day off and thought the families mattered more than he did. She did not yet know what to do with that, but she wrote it down. In the afternoon, when the heat had softened slightly and the main digging had been done, Mrs. Vega, who had also come out in her capacity as someone who knew everyone's business and had strong feelings about the injustice of powerful men pressuring small families, organized an impromptu meal from the baskets of food the homesteading women had brought. People gathered in the shade of several large cottonwood trees, and someone produced a fiddle, and the afternoon became something other than a work project. Jane found herself sitting near Henry Crawford, because the shade of the cottonwood she had chosen happened to be the same shade he had chosen, which was entirely coincidental, and if it was not entirely coincidental, she was not prepared to admit that yet. They talked for a long time, longer than they had talked before, and with less of the professional structure she usually imposed on her conversations with sources. He told her about growing up on the frontier, about the particular education of learning to read weather and land and the moods of cattle and horses. He had read more books than she might have expected, he said, with a slight self-consciousness that she found unexpectedly touching. His mother had been a schoolteacher before she married his father, and books had been a priority even in a house with dirt floors and no glass in the windows. He had opinions about literature that surprised her with their specificity and depth. She told him about Boston, about the journalism, the suffragette meetings, the arguments she had had with her editor about which stories were worth telling. She told him about her mother, who had died when Jane was 19, and about her father, who was a professor of history at Harvard, and who had read her first newspaper byline with an expression of surprised pride that she had kept carefully in her memory ever since. He listened to all of this with the full, unhurried attention that was, she was beginning to understand, simply the way he listened to everything. He asked questions that were precise and genuine, not the polite questions people ask in order to have an excuse to talk about themselves again, but the real questions of someone who actually wants to know the answer. Why journalism? He asked at one point. Because I wanted to tell the truth about things, she said. And journalism is a way of insisting that the truth matters enough to be written down. He was quiet for a moment. That's a good reason, he said. And then, after a pause, are you finding the truth out here? I'm finding, she said carefully, that the truth out here is more complicated and more interesting than the truth in Boston. He nodded and glanced at her sideways, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Does that mean you'll stay longer? I don't know yet, she said, which was the first time she had said anything other than a definitive eventual date of departure. The fiddle played on in the cottonwood shade, and the homesteading families laughed and talked, and Jane Morgan sat beside a man she barely knew and felt, with a clarity she found slightly alarming, entirely at home. She rode back to Cale's crossing in the early evening, the sky turning colors she still had not managed to name. Henry Crawford rode part of the same road, heading northeast toward the Callaway Ranch, and for a mile or so they rode alongside each other without any necessity to speak, the horses moving at an easy pace, the land going golden around them. When the northeast trail diverged from the road back to town, he pulled up and touched his hat. "Good evening, Miss Morgan." "Good evening, Mr. Crawford." She paused. "You should let me use your name in the article, about the well." About standing up for the homesteaders against Callaway's pressure. He considered this for a long, weighing moment. "All right," he said finally. "If you think it'll do more good than harm." "I do." He nodded once, turned his horse toward the northeast, and rode away into the gold evening, and Jane watched him go for longer than was strictly necessary before she clicked her tongue at Pearl and rode back toward town. July came in hot and bright and full of consequence. Her article about the well and the homesteaders and the Callaway Operations Pressure Campaign was published in Boston at the start of the month, and the response was significant enough that her editor sent a telegraph message that she read with a complicated mixture of pride and something that felt like the first stirrings of guilt. The article had been read by people in positions of influence. There were questions being asked in the relevant territorial offices about the legality of Callaway's methods. Change, her editor said, was possibly coming. She also received a visit from Mr. Elias Callaway himself. He came to the boarding house on a Thursday morning, a large and florid man of perhaps 55 with the manner of someone who was accustomed to arriving places and having people adjust themselves accordingly. He sat across from Jane in Mrs. Vega's small parlor and told her, with a surface pleasantness that did not quite cover the harder thing beneath it, that he hoped she understood the delicate balance of interests out here in the territory, and that he would hate for an outsider's perspective to inadvertently cause damage to a community she did not fully understand. "I appreciate your concern," Jane said, pleasantly but firmly. "But the homesteaders I wrote about have a legal right to their claim, and the well they built with their own labor on their own land is not a delicate balance of interests. It is simply the law." Callaway studied her for a moment. "You named Henry Crawford in that article. Mr. Crawford spoke as a private citizen about matters of public concern," Jane said. "He has every right to do so." "Crawford works for me," Callaway said. "Crawford works for you on the Callaway Ranch," Jane agreed. "On his time away from that work, he is his own man." Callaway left without further pleasantries. Mrs. Vega, who had been making tea in the adjacent kitchen with the focused attention of someone listening through the wall, appeared with 2 cups and a satisfied expression and said, "Good girl." Henry Crawford came into town 2 days later, which was not a Saturday, which was unusual enough that Jane noticed it from her window and felt her pulse do something she chose to attribute to too much coffee. He came to the boarding house and asked for her specifically, which Mrs. Vega relayed with an expression of absolute neutrality that contained, Jane suspected, significant interior celebration. They walked along the edge of town, where the main street dissolved into a dirt track that wound toward a stand of cottonwoods at the bank of a small creek. Jane had found this spot in her first week and returned to it often when she needed to think. It seemed slightly strange to be bringing someone else here, and yet also not strange at all. He told her that Callaway had called him into his office and told him that his position at the ranch was being reconsidered. He said this without drama, with the steady voice of a man who had known the conversation might come and had decided in advance what he thought about it. "I'm sorry," Jane said immediately, with genuine feeling. "Henry, I'm sorry. I didn't want this to happen to you." It was the first time she had used his given name. She heard herself do it and felt the air between them change slightly, become something slightly warmer, slightly more real. "Don't be sorry," he said. "I knew what I was doing when I said what I said, and I meant it." He looked at the creek, which was low and slow in the July heat. "If telling the truth cost me a job, that's the price of the truth. You know something about that." She did. She had written articles that had cost her sources and her editor's patience both, and she had made her peace with the mathematics of honesty long ago. But it was different to have it cost someone else something. "What will you do?" she asked. "There's always work for a man who knows cattle and land," he said. "Maybe I'll finally try running my own small operation. I've got some money saved." He paused. "My family's homestead is still registered in my name. My father filed the claim but never officially transferred it. It's small, but the water's good." Jane looked at him. "You told me about that well, the one you dug with your father when you were 14. "Yes. And you want to try your own place." "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said. "This may be the push I needed." She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "It sounds like a beginning," she said. He turned toward her, and she could feel him looking at her in that steady, full-attention way of his, and she made herself meet his eyes. The amber in them was very warm in the afternoon light. "It could be," he said. And then, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, "I'd like to see you again, Miss Morgan, if you're willing, not as a source for your articles." Her heart did something quick and helpless in her chest. "Jane," she said. "My name is Jane." The corner of his mouth moved into that almost smile, and then became a full smile, which she discovered was something she had not actually seen from him before. It rearranged his whole face into something warmer and younger and more open, and the effect of it was considerable. "Jane," he said. "Henry," she said. They stood by the creek in the July heat, and a great deal was understood between them without being spoken, because some things are better understood than spoken, at least at first. He began coming to town more often after that, with purposes that grew steadily less connected to practical supply buying, and more connected to the simple fact of her presence. They would walk to the creek, or sit on the boardwalk in the evening when the heat relented, or share a meal at the small restaurant that operated out of the back of the saloon 2 nights a week. Mrs. Vega tracked these developments with the focused attention of a general planning a campaign, and said nothing directly, but began ensuring that fresh coffee was always available when Henry Crawford came calling. He told her, in pieces and fragments over the course of several evenings, about his life. He had grown up the son of homesteaders who had come west in the 1860s, his father from Tennessee and his mother from Ohio, following the pull of the Homestead Act and the dream of land. His childhood had been hard and extraordinary in equal measure, full of the particular freedom of open country and the particular harshness of a life that left no room for softness about the practical necessities of survival. His younger sister had died of fever when he was 12, and the grief of it had shaped him in ways he described quietly and without seeking pity. He had gone to work for the Cowboy operation at 20, because it was steady work, and because his father's health had required that he contribute money to the household, and had stayed because he was good at it, and because the land itself was a reason to stay. He had not, he said in a quiet and careful voice, found another reason, until recently. Jane held that statement in her chest for a long moment before she trusted herself to respond to it. "Henry," she said, "I know you came out here for a season," he said. "I know you have a life in Boston. I'm not asking you to make any decisions or any promises. I just wanted you to know where I stand." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had grown up in this place, who was so entirely woven into the fabric of this land that she sometimes thought she could not look at the territory around her without seeing the quality of his attention in it. She thought about Boston, the wet, cold winters, the apartment with its foggy windows, the desk where she sat and wrote about places far away. "I've been trying to write my next article," she said, "about what it feels like to arrive somewhere and find that it is more yours than anywhere else has been." He was very still. "I don't know what that means yet," she said honestly, "but I'm trying to find out." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her deliberately, and his hand was large and warm and steady, and she felt it in every nerve in her body like a clear, ringing note. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed were the most vivid of Jane Morgan's life. She wrote in the mornings, letters to Boston and articles and the private notebook that was filling up with things she was not yet ready to call what they were. She explored in the afternoons, riding out across the territory with Pearl and a canteen of water, documenting what she found: the landscape, the people, the enormous, complex life of a place that the people who had never been here imagined was simply empty. She spent evenings with Henry, sometimes with other people around them, sometimes not. He showed her his family's homestead in early August, riding out with her on a clear morning when the mountains to the west were particularly sharp against the sky. It was a piece of land that had the quality of a promise, not much yet, a small house that needed work, a good pasture land that had been neglected but was not ruined. He showed her all of it with a kind of careful hoping, as if he were not quite ready to believe in it himself. She stood in the middle of the pasture and looked at the mountains and said, "I can see why someone would fight to keep this." "I am fighting to keep it," he said, standing beside her. "I filed the registration again last week. Made sure everything was properly in order. It's mine legally and properly." She looked at him. "Good." He looked at her. Something in the air between them had been building for weeks, pulling tight with a gentle, inevitable tension, and she could feel it now as a kind of gravity. "Jane," he said, in a different voice than usual, lower and less contained, with something naked in it that she had not heard from him before. She stepped toward him, which answered everything. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything else, fully present and entirely certain, one hand framing her face with a gentleness that was also absolute, and she felt it not only as warmth but as arrival, as the particular settling sensation of reaching a place you had been traveling toward without knowing you were traveling at all. When they broke apart, the mountains were there, and the pasture land, and the good well with its water that had been running for years. "I don't know how to be someone who does this," she said, because she was honest and she was not going to stop being honest now of all times. "Neither do I," he said. "Not particularly." "We'll figure it out then," she said. He smiled that full, open smile that she had now seen many times and still felt like a kind of gift each time it appeared. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she said. August moved through them in a golden haze that Jane would remember for the rest of her life as the time she became someone slightly different from the person she had been, or perhaps the time she became more fully the person she had always been without quite knowing it. The distinction mattered, and she thought about it sometimes in the early mornings when she sat at her desk by the window with her coffee and watched the main street wake up and felt, in a way she had never felt in Boston, the rightness of being exactly where she was. She and Henry fell into an easiness with each other that surprised her with how natural it felt. She had worried privately that the differences between them would be too great. The education, the background, the different worlds they had been shaped by. What she found instead was that the things they had in common were the things that mattered. The seriousness about honesty, the belief that people deserved fair treatment regardless of their origins or their circumstances, the capacity for attention, the appreciation for silence. And the ways they differed made them interesting to each other, kept the conversations full and surprising, sent each of them away from evenings together with new thoughts to carry. She wrote about it in her private notebook, not in the coded, careful language she had been using to describe her growing feelings, but directly and without apology. She wrote that she was in love with Henry Crawford, which was not a statement she had made about anyone before, and she sat with the words for a long while after she had written them, feeling their weight and finding that it was a good weight, the weight of something that was true. She had not yet told him in those words. She was working her way toward it. She was not afraid of it exactly. She was simply giving it the care it deserved. The letter from her editor arrived in the last week of August. It was long and warm and enthusiastic, and it contained, midway through the second page, a new proposition. The Gazette wanted her in Washington by October. There was a story there, a major story about the politics of Western land rights, and her editor felt, correctly, she had to admit that her months in the territory had given her the depth of understanding to cover it better than anyone else on the staff. It was the kind of assignment that represented exactly the kind of career advancement she had been working toward for 3 years. She read the letter twice and then sat with it in her hands and looked out her window at the main street of Cowes crossing in the afternoon sun and felt, very clearly, what she thought about it. She thought about it for 3 days before she talked to Henry. She wanted to be sure of herself before she said anything to him, because he was not someone she was willing to mislead or confuse for the sake of her own uncertainty. On the 4th day, she rode out to his homestead. She did this now with the ease of habit, Pearl knowing the way, and found him working on the roof of the small house, replacing weathered boards with new timber he had cut and hauled himself. He came down when he heard her horse, and she sat on the porch step and told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting, his forearms resting on his knees, his hat in his hands. When she finished, there was a silence. It was not comfortable the way their silences usually were. It had weight in it. "Washington," he said, "by October." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands for a moment, and she could see him working through something, taking it apart and examining it with the same careful honesty he brought to everything, refusing to give her an answer that was not genuine. "Is it what you want?" he asked finally. And there it was. The question, and the fact that he asked it rather than telling her what he wanted from her, which she knew was considerable, felt like the clearest expression of who he was that she had ever encountered. "6 weeks ago," she said, "the answer would have been yes without hesitation." She looked at him steadily. "Now I find myself in the position of wanting something else more, and that is not a position I expected to be in, and I am not saying it to place any obligation on you. I am saying it because I told myself that I would always tell the truth to you." He raised his eyes from his hands and looked at her. "Jane, I'm in love with you," she said. "I wrote it down 3 days ago, and I have been carrying it since then, and I would rather say it plainly than let it sit unsaid any longer. I am in love with you, and I have been for some time, and I think I knew it at the creek in July when you took my hand, and I felt like I had been holding my breath for weeks and finally stopped." He was absolutely still for a moment. Then he stood and crossed the small distance between them, and knelt so that his face was level with hers, which had the effect of making the whole world contract to just the space immediately around them. "I have been in love with you," he said, his voice quieter than usual and more unguarded than she had ever heard it, "since the day you walked out of the general store in April and told me it was a long way to come and looked at me like you were actually interested in what I might say back." She felt something release in her chest, a tension she had not known was the last remaining one. "I was interested," she said. "I know," he said. "I had not met many people who were." She took his face in both hands, and he covered her hands with his, and the mountains were there against the sky behind him, and she thought that she had come here for 4 months and she was not going anywhere. "I'm not going to Washington," she said. He shook his head. "Don't make that decision because of me. I won't. I'm not making it because of you," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm making it because of me. Because when I imagine being in a Washington office in October writing about land rights in a place I no longer live, and then I imagine being here, I understand clearly which one I am choosing and why." She paused. "I can write from here. My editor will have opinions about that, but my editor has always had opinions and has always come around eventually." Henry looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not entirely read, which was unusual because she had become quite good at reading him. It contained, she thought, a number of things at once relief and something cautious and a great deal of warmth, and underneath all of it, a kind of wonder that someone had been willing to choose this particular version of a life. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I have never been more certain of anything," she said, and meant it with every part of herself. He kissed her, there on the porch step of the small house he was repairing with his own hands on land his father had filed a claim for, and he had made his own, and it was long and warm and utterly serious, the kind of kiss that means exactly what it means and does not hedge or qualify. She wrote to her editor that week. The letter was warm and professional and explained, without excessive detail, that she had made a decision to remain in the territory and continue writing from there, and that she hoped the Gazette would be willing to work with her in this arrangement. If not, she understood, and she would find another outlet. Her editor wrote back within 2 weeks, alternating between expressions of exasperation and genuine admiration in a way that was very characteristic of him, and agreed, on the condition that she produce a minimum of 1 major article per month, to the arrangement. She wrote back to say that she would likely produce more than one. September in the territory was spectacular in a way she had not anticipated, the heat breaking into a warmth that was still considerable but had lost its oppressive weight, the light changing quality and becoming something more golden and slanted. The mornings cool enough that she wore her shawl, and the afternoons still warm enough to sit outside. The cottonwoods along the creek began to turn, going gold at the edges in a way that made the whole landscape feel like something on the edge of revelation. She and Henry talked about the future in the plain-spoken, practical way of two people who have established where they stand with each other and are now interested in the concrete details. He was working on the homestead in earnest now, had purchased a small number of cattle to start his own operation, and was doing occasional work for other ranchers in the area to supplement his income while the homestead developed. The work was hard and the money was modest, but the satisfaction in his face when he talked about it was something she found very beautiful. He asked her to marry him in October, sitting on the porch of his homestead at dusk, in the same quiet, direct way that he did everything. No dramatic staging, no grand speech, just the honest offering of the thing itself. "I love you," he said. "I want you to be my wife. I know this is not the life you planned when you came here. I know it is different from Boston. I am asking you to choose it anyway, and I am asking you because I believe you have already been choosing it, and I want to make that real and formal and as committed as I can make it." She said yes before he had finished the sentence. She said yes and then laughed at herself for saying it before he was done, and he looked at her with that open, full smile and laughed too, and she climbed into his arms and felt the steady warmth of him around her, and thought that she had traveled a very long way to find something she had not known she was looking for. They were married in December of 1878, in the small adobe church in Cale's Crossing, in a ceremony conducted by the Reverend in front of what appeared to be the entirety of the town's population. Because in a small frontier community, a wedding was a significant and communal event, and people turned out for it with genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Vega cried, which she did without any embarrassment whatsoever, and Gerald Bright made a toast at the reception held at the saloon afterward that went on considerably longer than necessary, but was warmly received nonetheless. Jane wore a dress she had made with considerable help from two of the homesteading women who had become her friends, cream-colored cotton with small ivory buttons down the back. Simple and practical, and she thought, exactly right for the landscape around her. Henry wore his best jacket, which he had clearly spent some time pressing, and his cleanest hat, and he looked at her when she walked into the church with an expression that she suspected she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. She wrote about the wedding in her private notebook, not for publication, just for the record, just so that the light and the warmth and the particular quality of that December afternoon in a small territory church would be preserved somewhere in words that would last. The winter that followed was cold and close and full of the particular intimacy of two people learning to share a life in a small house that Henry was steadily improving with his own work and Jane's income from the Gazette. She wrote at a table by the single window, the mountains visible in the clear winter air, and he came in from outside work smelling of cold air and horses and sometimes wood smoke, and the smallness of the house was not a limitation but a warmth. She sent 5 major articles to the Gazette that winter. 2 were about the ongoing land rights battles in the territory, drawing on her months of observation and her conversations with everyone from homesteaders to territorial officials to the Pueblo community leaders who had been generous enough to speak with her. 1 was about the water rights issues that were becoming increasingly critical as cattle operations expanded. 1 was a profile of 3 women who had come west and built independent lives, and what those lives had taught them about the nature of freedom and possibility. The last was a personal essay, carefully and deliberately written, about what it meant to arrive somewhere for a season and find that the season had become your life. That last article was the one that generated the most correspondence. She received letters from women across the country who recognized something in it, the experience of a life that did not go according to plan and became something better for it. She answered as many as she could. Spring arrived in 1879 with its particular extravagance, the land going suddenly and abundantly green in a way that always surprised her no matter how many times she saw it. The creek ran full and fast, and the cottonwoods put out new leaves, and Henry's small cattle herd was expanding in a way that was beginning to look genuinely promising. In March, she realized she was expecting their first child. She told Henry at supper, with the directness that was simply her way. He put down his fork and looked at her across the table, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before, something very deep moving in it, a kind of awe mixed with something quiet and profound. He came around the table and took her hands and held them for a long moment without speaking, and she felt the slight trembling in his that he would never mention and that she would never mention either but would always remember. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Are you?" "I'm quite well," she said. "I have spoken to Dr. Hartwell and she says everything appears healthy and normal." She paused. "You look slightly alarmed." "I'm not alarmed," he said, with the particular careful dignity of a man who is, in fact, slightly alarmed. "I am extraordinarily glad, and perhaps one or two other things simultaneously." "That's a reasonable response," she said. The pregnancy was, all things considered, straightforward, not without its difficulties. The nausea in the early months was significant, and the territory summers were not designed for comfort at full term. But Dr. Hartwell, who was a quietly fierce woman in her 40s who had come west from Ohio and established the first proper medical practice in Cale's Crossing 2 years prior, was competent and reassuring. And Henry was present and attentive in a way that managed to be helpful rather than anxious, which she appreciated considerably. She continued writing throughout. Her editor, who had by now made his peace with her arrangement, and was in fact quietly proud of what she was producing, published her work regularly, and the articles about life in the territory had developed a significant readership that the Gazette valued. She was, by any reasonable measure, exactly what she had set out to become when she had sat at her Boston desk 3 years earlier and read the letter about a season on the frontier. Only the geography and several other things had changed. Their son was born in November of 1879, a healthy and loudly opinionated boy whom they named Thomas James Crawford, the Thomas for Henry's father, and the James a small acknowledgement of Jane's own family history. He arrived in the world looking, Jane thought, somewhat indignant about the whole process, which she felt was a perfectly reasonable response and possibly indicated good sense. Henry held him with the focused, gentle certainty he brought to everything else, and Jane watched her husband hold their son in the lamplight of their home and felt something so full in her chest that she had no word for it in the vocabulary she had constructed over 26 years of careful, specific language. Thomas was a vivid baby and then a vivid toddler, full of opinions and curiosity, and a physical energy that expressed itself primarily in his determination to be wherever he was not supposed to be. Henry taught him to ride almost as soon as he could sit up properly, and did it with a patience that Jane documented extensively in letters to her father in Boston, who had visited the territory once, in the summer of 1880, and had arrived with an air of polite skepticism and left with an expression of genuine conversion. Her father had liked Henry immediately, which she had hoped for and not been entirely certain about. The two men were different in obvious ways, but they had in common a quality of seriousness about truth and a kind of fundamental decency that her father, who was a historian and had spent 50 years studying human behavior, could recognize regardless of its circumstances. They had sat on the porch together in the evenings and talked, and Jane had watched from the window and felt very full. The homestead grew in those years. Henry expanded the cattle operation steadily, with the careful, patient management of someone who understood that sustainable growth was more valuable than rapid expansion. He hired 2 ranch hands in 1880, young men from the area, one of them the son of a homesteading family who had been there from the early days. He built a proper barn and repaired the house substantially, adding 2 rooms so that the growing family had more space, and replaced the single window with 2 larger ones so that Jane had more light at her writing table. She had moved her writing table to face the mountains. The Calloway dispute had resolved itself, eventually, in the way that disputes often do when someone keeps insisting on the truth in public with sufficient skill and regularity. The territorial authorities, responding to pressure that Jane's articles had significantly contributed to generating, had investigated and confirmed the legality of the homesteaders' land claims, and issued clear guidance that unauthorized pressure on legal claims was not to be tolerated. Elias Calloway had grumbled but complied, because he was, above all else, a man who understood when a position was no longer tenable. He had never fully forgiven Henry Crawford for being the man who spoke publicly on the wrong side of the issue, from his perspective, but he had found he needed a man of Henry's skill and reputation from time to time when he was dealing with complex cattle-related questions, and so a kind of gruff, purely professional relationship had eventually established itself. Henry treated it with equanimity. Jane treated it with the amused patience of someone who had dealt with many Calloways in her professional life and had learned that the most useful response was simply to outlast them. In 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Ruth Eleanor Crawford Eleanor for Jane's mother, and she arrived in the world with a very different temperament than Thomas, quiet and observant where he was loud and active, with Henry's amber eyes and Jane's auburn hair, and it became apparent fairly early, an alarming amount of both parents' capacity for focused attention. Jane's articles had by this point made her name in a way that her editor had predicted and she had worked for, and which felt, now that it had happened, both satisfying and somewhat beside the point. She was a good journalist. She wrote things worth reading, and the work felt meaningful in the ways that mattered. She did not particularly need the reputation to feel that the work was worthwhile, but she was glad it was there, because it meant that the things she wrote had a wider reach, and reach was how you changed the things that needed changing. She wrote about the injustices she saw with the same clarity and persistence that had characterized her work from the beginning. She wrote about the continuing dispossession of native peoples from land that had been theirs in ways that no law could fully account for, and no legal framework of the time adequately addressed. She used the word injustice plainly and without softening it, because it was the accurate word, and because accuracy mattered. She knew that her articles alone could not solve the large, systemic, deeply embedded wrongs she was writing about, but she believed with the conviction that had sent her to journalism in the first place that bearing witness to truth was not a small thing, and that writing it down and insisting it be read was a form of work that the world required. Henry read everything she wrote. He was her first reader, a role he had grown into without either of them quite planning it, and he was both the most honest and the most useful reader she had because he approached the work with genuine engagement and told her plainly when something was not clear or when he thought an argument could be stronger. She returned the favor by being the first listener for the things he was working through about the land and the cattle operation and the world as he moved through it, and they had developed over the years a conversation between them that had no end and no desire for one. Thomas was 3.5 when Ruth was born, and his response to a baby sister was one of immediate and proprietary enthusiasm, which was both touching and occasionally exhausting. He wanted to show her everything and tell her everything and carry her places she did not need to be carried, and Henry spent a significant amount of time patiently explaining the limits of small baby's interest in being dragged to see interesting rocks. Ruth, for her part, developed at an early age a precise and effective expression of tolerance for her brother that she would employ throughout her childhood. The years settled into the particular rhythm of a life that is full without being frantic, busy with the genuine substance of work and love, and the needs of children and land, punctuated by the weather and the seasons and the occasional drama of frontier community life. Cattle got sick and recovered or didn't, and the rains came or they didn't, and neighbors had disputes and the sheriff got involved and the disputes were resolved, and the children grew and needed new boots with startling regularity, and the writing desk faced the mountains and the words kept coming. Jane turned 30 in 1881 and celebrated it with a small supper at the homestead with Mrs. Vega and Gerald and his wife Maria and Dr. Hartwell, who had become a good friend, and the two ranch hands, Will and Samuel, who were practically part of the household anyway, and she looked around the table in the lamplight and felt that the things she was most grateful for were all visible to her from exactly where she sat. Henry had made her a gift, not bought it, made it, a small wooden box with her initials carved into the lid, made from timber he had shaped and finished himself in the evenings for weeks without her noticing. Inside it was a letter, written in his careful, precise hand, that told her what she had come to mean to him. She read it at the table and then had to put it down for a moment because her eyes were not entirely reliable. "Henry Crawford," Mrs. Vega said firmly, "you are a good man." "He is," Jane agreed when she trusted her voice. Henry, who had gone slightly pink at the ears in a way she found extremely endearing, looked at his plate and said something modest about the timber, which everyone ignored. In the summer of 1883, when Thomas was 4 and Ruth was nearly 1, an unexpected piece of correspondence arrived that Jane sat with for 2 full days before she showed it to Henry. It was from a publisher in New York, a substantial house, one she knew and respected, asking whether she had any interest in compiling her territory articles into a book, along with new material, a full account of the life she had built here and what it had taught her about the West and about the country and about herself. She brought it to Henry on the second evening, after the children were in bed and they were sitting on the porch in the warm summer dark. He read it carefully. He was quiet for a moment after, then he folded it and handed it back to her. "Well," she asked. "What do you think?" he asked, because this was how he always began. "I think it would be a significant undertaking," she said. "I think it would mean perhaps 2 years of serious work on top of everything else. I think it would be hard." She paused. "I also think the book would be very good and that the things I want to say in it deserve the space a book can give them." He nodded. "Then you should write it." "It would take time from us," she said. "You have never stopped giving this family what it needs," he said quietly. "And I know how to wait for a woman who's working." "I've had some practice." She laughed, which she had not expected to do in that moment. He smiled his full, open smile. "Write the book, Jane," he said. She wrote the book. It took 2 years, exactly as she had predicted, 2 years of early mornings and late evenings and weekends, and every spare piece of time she could find. Henry managed the homestead and the children with the same capable steadiness with which he managed everything, and Will and Samuel helped more than their wages strictly required because they were, by that point, genuinely fond of the family they worked for. Mrs. Vega came out to the homestead on several afternoons a week to mind Thomas and Ruth with the focused love of a woman who had no grandchildren of her own and was correcting that oversight. The book was published in 1886. It was called The Permanent Season, a title Jane had found in her private notebook from the early days, from the entry where she had written about coming for 1 season and staying, before she had fully understood what staying would mean. The response was significant. The book was reviewed widely and seriously, and the reviews were, with very few exceptions, excellent. It was read by people who had never been West and who wrote to her afterward saying that they felt they had been there now. It was read by people in Washington who were making decisions about Western land and water rights, and who she hoped, with guarded optimism, might be influenced by what it said. It was read by women who were thinking about leaving the lives they had planned for the lives they might actually want, and who found in it the particular courage that comes from knowing someone else has done the thing you are afraid to try. Jane was 35 when the book was published, and she sat at the writing desk that faced the mountains with a copy of it in her hands, and felt the satisfaction of having made something lasting out of something true. Thomas was 7 by then, growing into a long-legged, bright-eyed boy who had his father's way with animals, and something of his mother's relentless need to understand the how and why of everything. A combination that produced a child who could spend 3 hours quietly watching a hawk hunt, and then ask very specific questions about migration patterns and wingspan, and whether the hawk had feelings about wind direction. Ruth was 5, small and precise, and already attempting to read, climbing onto laps with books in hand with a determination that was not entirely surprising given her parentage. Henry read the book in its entirety over 3 evenings in the quiet after the children were in bed, and when he finished it he set it down on the kitchen table and was silent for a while, and Jane watched him from across the table. "You wrote about me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I changed the details enough that it is not identifiable as specifically you, but yes." He was quiet again. "You wrote that you saw me ride into town and felt something that you described as watching something that was precisely where it was supposed to be." "I did," she said, "because that is what it felt like." He looked at her across the table, in the lamplight, in the house he had built with his hands on land that was his, and she looked back at him, and the years between that April afternoon in 1878 and this kitchen in 1886 were all present somehow in the way they looked at each other, all of it accumulated and held. "I felt the same thing," he said, "when you turned around in that store and told me it was a long way to come. I felt like something had arrived that I had not known I was waiting for." "You never told me that," she said. "I'm telling you now," he said. She got up from her chair and came around the table and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the lamplit kitchen while the children slept and the territory was dark and quiet outside, and the mountains were somewhere in the darkness doing what mountains do, patient and permanent and indifferent to the small bright thing happening inside this house. "Henry," she said. "Yes." "I came out here for 1 season," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm rather glad I stayed." He turned his head and looked at her, and his amber eyes were warm and amused and full of everything they had accumulated together. "I'm rather glad you stayed too," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against the top of her head, and neither of them said anything else for a while. In the years that followed, the homestead continued to grow, and the children continued to grow, and Jane continued to write, and Henry continued to work the land with the same patient skill and honest commitment that he had brought to everything he had ever done. A third child arrived in 1888, a second son they named William Arthur Crawford, William for the ranch hand who had by then become more family than employee, and Arthur because Jane had always liked the name, which Henry found slightly amusing and accepted with good grace. William was a different kind of child again, easygoing where Thomas was intense and quiet where Ruth was observant. With a cheerful adaptability that seemed to make every situation he found himself in simply the new acceptable version of things. He had Jane's gray-green eyes and Henry's dark hair, and was, from his very earliest days, the kind of person who made a room warmer by being in it. Thomas went east for schooling when he was 14, to a proper school in Santa Fe that had been recommended by Dr. Hartwell, and the leaving of him was hard in the way that all necessary hard things are. He came back for summers and for Christmas, and each time he came back he had grown in ways that were wonderful and sometimes surprising, becoming more himself in the particular way that young people do when they are given room and resources to do it. He wanted to study law, he told them when he was 17, with the particular conviction of someone who has found the right shape for what he values. He wanted to study land law specifically, he said, because he had grown up hearing about what happened when the law was used well and what happened when it was used badly, and he wanted to be someone who used it well. Henry looked at his son across the supper table and said that seemed like a very fine plan. Jane looked at her son and felt something she could only describe as culmination, not an ending, but a completion of a particular kind, the sense of a thing having been built correctly all the way to this point. Ruth showed, by the time she was 10, a clear and serious inclination toward science, specifically toward the natural world, plants, animals, weather, the patterns that organized life in the territory. She spent hours outside with notebooks that were beginning to resemble her mother's in their density and precision, documenting what she saw with a rigor that made Dr. Hartwell, who was increasingly her mentor and champion, speak about her with genuine excitement. There would be a way forward for Ruth in science, Dr. Hartwell said. It would require fighting for the opportunities that were not yet fully available to women, but the fighting would be worth it. And Ruth was, Dr. Hartwell said with considerable certainty, exactly the kind of person who was capable of fighting for them. Jane wrote about that too, about her daughter and her notebooks, and the particular quality of a child's mind engaging with the world with complete, unconditioned seriousness. She wrote about what it meant to raise children on the frontier, the gifts of it and the hardships of it, and the ways it made people who were both tough and sensitive, both practical and visionary, because the land itself required both. She continued to write about the injustices. There was always more to write about. The displacement of native peoples continued, and the legal frameworks that were supposed to protect them were applied with the inconsistency and selective generosity of systems designed primarily to serve the people who built them. Jane wrote about it without softening it, because the truth did not become less true because it was uncomfortable, and because she had never, in all her years of writing, found a good reason to flinch. Henry sometimes came in at the end of the day, when she had spent the afternoon with a particularly difficult article, and would sit at the table while she told him what she was writing about and why it was hard, and he would listen with his full, complete attention, and then say something that helped her see the right way through it. He had a quality she had come to rely on, a capacity to look at a complicated thing and find the true center of it, which was not a simple skill, and which she told him she valued enormously. He told her he felt the same way about the way she looked at the land and the people in it, with the honest, loving attention of someone who had chosen to be here and meant the choice with everything she had. Mrs. Vega died in the spring of 1891, peacefully, and at a great old age, in her own bed in the boarding house that she had run for 30 years. The town mourned her with the genuine, wholehearted grief of a community that had lost someone who was part of its essential structure. Jane cried with the uncomplicated honesty of someone who had loved the woman without reservation and felt the loss clearly. She wrote an obituary that ran in the Gazette and in the local paper, and she wrote it as well as she had ever written anything. After the funeral, Gerald Bright told Jane that Mrs. Vega had spoken about her often in her later years, with the particular satisfaction of someone watching a thing go right. She had said that she had known, from the moment Jane Morgan had come to the boarding house with her 2 trunks and her small valise and her serious eyes, that the girl was not going back to Boston. How could she have known that? Jane asked. Gerald smiled. She said she had seen the look before. People who arrive somewhere and are home before they know it. Jane thought about that for a long time. She thought about April of 1878, the trunks and the valise and the notebook and the certainty she had carried with her that this was temporary, that she was a visitor with a plan and a deadline and a return ticket. She thought about Pearl the mare and the main street through a boarding house window, and a rider coming in from the North Road on an afternoon in April who looked, she had thought, precisely where he was supposed to be. She thought about all the seasons that had followed that first one, each one layering itself over the ones before until they had become the substance of her life, not a detour from her life, not a departure from it, but the life itself, the actual version of the thing she had been trying to build. Henry was in the pasture when she got home, working with a new horse, moving through the patient, repetitive work of building trust with an animal that did not yet know him. He looked up when she rode in and crossed to meet her and took her hand when she dismounted. "How are you?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him in the afternoon light of a spring day in 1891, this man she had known for 13 years and been married to for 12, who had shaped her life and who she had shaped in turn, whose children played in the house behind them and whose land stretched out around them to the mountains that she had never quite found words good enough for. "About how I came here for one season," she said. "And stayed," he said. "And stayed," she agreed. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was not one he used often and which, for that reason, carried considerable weight when he did. He looked at her over her hand with those amber eyes that were, if anything, warmer than they had ever been, the years having done to him what the best years do to certain people, which is to settle what was uncertain and deepen what was already rich. "Thank God for that," he said simply. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the pasture with the mountains to the west doing what mountains always did, and the spring light falling around them, and the children somewhere in the house beginning to make the sounds of children approaching dinner time, with the relentless inevitability that she had come to find one of the most comforting sounds she knew. Henry Crawford was 45 years old in 1891, still broad-shouldered and capable and honest, with threads of gray appearing in his dark hair that Jane found extremely distinguished, which she told him regularly enough that he had stopped protesting it. He worked his land with the same commitment he had always brought to it, and managed his cattle with the skill that had made him the person people came to with questions. And he read in the evenings and talked to his children with the full attention. He gave everything, and loved his wife with the steady, certain warmth of a man who had decided years ago what he valued, and had never found reason to revise that decision. Jane Morgan Crawford was 40 years old, and she was a woman who had 2 published books, a third in progress, and a reputation in American journalism that had been built on the principle of telling the truth about the places and people that deserved to be seen. She had silver in her auburn hair that she wore without apology and eyes that were still the color of the Atlantic on an overcast afternoon, but which, when she was happy, which was often, were more green than gray. She had a writing table that faced the mountains and children who read and a husband who listened, and a community she loved, and a life that had not gone according to any plan she had ever made, which she had concluded was the best possible thing that could have happened to it. She finished her 3rd book in 1893, a collection of essays about women in the West, their stories and their struggles and their particular, remarkable variety of courage. It was dedicated, on its title page, to Henry Crawford, and below his name were the words, "Who knew the difference between where someone comes from and where they belong?" He read the dedication standing in the kitchen on the morning the advance copy arrived and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a roughness in his voice that was not usual, "Jane." "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you every day for 15 years, and I will love you for the rest of my life." "I know," she said gently. "I love you too, every day, for the rest of mine." William, who was 5 and entirely unimpressed by sentiment, except insofar as it produced hugs, climbed between them with the practiced confidence of a child who knows he is welcome, and said he was hungry. Jane and Henry looked at each other over their youngest son's head and laughed, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the mountains were there in the clear morning air, patient and permanent, the way they always were, the way they would always be. It was, Jane thought, as she moved to the stove to make breakfast while Henry swung William up onto his hip, and Ruth appeared in the doorway with her latest notebook and Thomas's most recent letter was on the table needing a reply. It was exactly the life she had not planned and completely the life she had chosen. And there was not one day of it, not one single solitary day, that she would have traded for anything the world had to offer elsewhere. She had come for one season and stayed for all of them, every season that followed, each one accumulating into something permanent and full and hers. And the cowboy she had seen riding into town one April afternoon, precisely where he was supposed to be, had turned out to be, in the most exact and literal sense, the reason, a reason she had not had a name for at first in those early weeks when she wrote careful journalist's observations and pretended not to notice that she was listening for a particular voice. She had the name for it now. She had had it for a long time. She called it home. She called it Henry. She called it the life she had been lucky enough to find by being in the right place at the right time with her notebook and her serious eyes and her willingness, finally, when the moment came, to put down the return ticket and stay. Outside, the New Mexico territory went about its immense and beautiful business under a sky that was still, after all these years, the most extraordinary blue she had ever seen. The mountain stood at the edge of the world and held it up. The creek ran its quiet, reliable course through the cottonwoods. The cattle moved in the pasture with the slow, certain purpose of cattle who have enough grass and water, and who want nothing more than this. And inside the warm kitchen of a homestead on land with good water, a family made breakfast together, and the morning opened around them like a hand held out, offering the day. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the most complete and irreducible sense of the word, everything.